I thought I should begin this session by just saying that I'm not an historian. If anybody wants to write anything down and using it at prosecution later, please accept my apologies. I'm a psychotherapist by background, long interested in applied psychoanalysis, the idea of applying psychoanalytic ideas to understanding historical phenomena and contemporary socio-political phenomena. It might be relevant also to say that I worked for the University in Cambridge about 10 years ago, and since then I've been retired, but I see an awful lot of ordinands and priests, which is really rather peculiar in many ways, because although I had a very religious upbringing, from about the age of 17 I would have described myself as being humanist. But somebody gave my name to one of the theological colleges about 7 years ago, and since then they've referred to me all their troubled ordinands. And Bruce Kinsey over there, who has been the sort of the referral point for the priests in the Ely diocese, also refers me priests, because he says I don't pathologise religion. Well, I don't ipso facto pathologise religion. I'm very interested, however, to think about it with people who come along with all sorts of other problems. So that's my personal background. But we thought we ought to finish the day with this general sort of roundup session and offer everybody an opportunity to ask questions, make comments, and take up issues that have arisen earlier in the day, and that we would begin some discussion of Norman's later work. And Sham on my right and Lorenzo on my left are going to begin that, and then lead into a sort of general discussion about that, about any other issues that have come up during the day, and I think particularly about the whole issue of the use of psychoanalytic ideas to understand historical phenomena, and also to understand perhaps what might be going on at present, the legitimacy of that, and the value of that, whether it is legitimate, whether it is valuable. So I'll ask Sham.
I'm Sham Ambiavaga, and I'm also not an historian, and where somebody previously described themselves as a bantamweight, I have to say I'm not even at any weight, not even featherweight. I think I can probably be described as the sort of the jester with bells in this setup. But my knowledge of Norman Cohn is really, first of all, I suppose, as a fan of his work, which I began reading in the 1980s. My background is as a journalist, and I first came across Norman Cohn's work, perhaps fittingly, as for a jester, in a strange publication called The Fortean Times, which is the journal of the paranormal. And this was in the context of the 1980s Cleveland child abuse scandal. That was in a lot of the press, and I was partly involved in reporting, partly because of the doctor, Marietta Higgs, who was involved in that, came to live and work in my area. I was working in Kent at the time. I read the Fortean Times article, which was one which looked to debunk the satanic ritual abuse idea that was going on, that was very much in the press. And it widely quoted Europe's Inner Demons as a prototype as the template of how witchcraft trials, how a group of people, well, it's you know what Europe's Inner Demons is about. It's about the idea of this secret society of satanic beings who are very, very powerful within wider society. So that was my first encounter with Norman's work, after which I then read The Pursuit of the Millennium and everything else that he ever wrote afterwards. And in the very late end of the 1990s, when I was working for the BBC, I was asked to produce a feature with a millennium theme, to do with the millennium, because of the turn of the millennium. And I chose to do one on the art of the apocalypse. And I chose this subject really as an excuse to go and meet Norman Cohn. It was a very successful ruse, and I did go and interview him in his cottage at Wood End, after which we became friends. And I continued to go and visit him at his cottage perhaps half a dozen times afterwards. We had many talks, and I think that I feel greatly privileged and enriched by my friendship, really, with him. Now, I've been asked to talk about these last two books, which has really rather caught me on the hop, because I haven't prepared anything about it, though I have read them, and I actually personally consider Cosmos Chaos to be one of his best, together with Pursuit of the Millennium, perhaps his best work. And I did reread that quite recently, so it's fairly fresh in my mind. Noah's Flood, his last published work, he actually gave to me as a present. I nearly always came away from his cottage with gifts of books. He was terribly generous in that way. And I also really enjoyed it. I haven't reread it recently, so it's not quite as fresh in my mind. So I'll say what I can about those two books. Cosmos Chaos, I thought, was really interesting. And I'll have to backtrack a bit and say that my attraction to Norman's work is really because of his psychoanalytic take on things, because it seemed to me apparent that he viewed history, he was interested in looking at history through the lens of understanding what human individuals are doing in here, what it is that's motivating them. So rather than looking at history through any kind of political lens or, any wider ideology, I think he's very interested in what motivates human beings to believe things that are unbelievable, or to do things that are unacceptable, perhaps even to themselves. And his entry into history seems to me to have been, from the very outset, a psychological one. It was prompted by his wish to understand what was going on in the minds of these Nazi officers that he was interrogating, and what was going on in the minds of the communists who had such an impact on what was going on in Russia and impact on the life of his wife, Vera. So that was his own motivation, and I think that motivation never ceased to the end of his life in terms of the way he looked at history. With Cosmos Chaos, I think one of the things that he was pursuing throughout his life was a look at the myths that people generate to explain the world, and that give direction to their own lives and their own actions, as well as their sense of identity, who they are, who they choose to identify themselves as groups or as individuals. And in Cosmos Chaos, the book, just to kind of summarise it very quickly, Cosmos Chaos and the End of Time, is a look at a mythology in the ancient world that shifts from being one of cosmos, one of a harmonious world, a world which is generally benevolent and harmonious, to one which is chaotic, which is chaos, which is destruction, which is an experience of destruction, in fact. And how these two experiences, one of a harmonious world and one of a chaotic world, coexisted for millennia, really, in mythology, and that in early myth there was always an idea of a chaos monster who would try to destroy the cosmos that existed, the harmony that existed, as well as a hero who kept at bay this chaos monster. But that these two things somehow coexisted in a kind of cyclical way. And what he traces is that at a certain point in early history, in the ancient world, there is a shift from this kind of belief, this kind of worldview, to one in which there is an end of time. You get a view of time as moving inexorably in one direction, and where no longer can cosmos and chaos coexist and hold each other in check, but one of them has to triumph over the other, and it becomes an end battle. It becomes something very final. And this he links as well. I mean, I can't summarise everything in the book, but he talks about I think he first puts down this view of an end of time and a final battle, a kind of final conflagration where good and evil fight it out, and there is a winner, and good will always triumph in this. He puts it down, he traces it to Zoroaster to begin with. But then, most interestingly, in my mind, is when he starts to talk about it in the context of Jewish mythology and belief, and then through to the Jesus sect, which is where he finishes the book. And I think that from a psychoanalytic point of view, it's very interesting to think of, I find it very interesting to think of myths being created as a kind of compensation against a painful reality, as a way of dealing, as a kind of defence, in fact, to deal with something that is actually too painful to digest. And the idea of perhaps one of the points that he makes in the book is that this the shift towards this more extreme position of a final kind of battle between good and evil, in which good will win, is something that becomes very taken up at the time of the Babylonian exile. So, in fact, at the time that the state of Israel has been pretty much exterminated, it's been wiped out as a political entity, and that this move towards, first of all, a monotheistic belief system, so it's no longer Yahweh existing alongside other gods and perhaps being superior, being better, but actually being the only God, and all the others being entirely discounted, happens at a time where the people have experienced a complete annihilation of their state. And there seems to be a kind of correlation between the trauma that suffered and the strength of the compensating belief that perhaps, could make it more tolerable. That's one idea, perhaps, that comes across in it. And he also, incidentally, in his last book, Noah's Flood, he traces the writing of the Noah's Flood myth to exactly the same period, to the Babylonian exile, to a point at which there was not just a temporary chaos, not a temporary breakdown in a system, but a real annihilation that was experienced. Now, Norman doesn't actually make these kind of psychoanalytical observations. That's not him. This is what somebody with a psychoanalytic thinking might infer or might try to draw out of it. But what is in his books is an amassing of evidence and an amassing of just painstaking gathering of work, which makes me feel that he had a really brilliant clinician's instinct. And it's there in all his works, the way he goes always to primary source material. He's never happy about taking somebody else's viewpoint on things. He goes back to finding out, really, it's that clinician's instinct that he has, which I think makes him very reluctant to come up with big ideas, with big suggestions at the end of it. I mean, he does come up with big ideas, but he doesn't go in with a thesis that he's trying to prove. It is what somebody else earlier today, I can't remember who it was, I think it was Frank Chalk actually, called Cohen's Unexpected Outcomes, how he always comes up with an unexpected thesis. I think this, to me, is a sign of a really good clinician, somebody who looks at the material and says, well, it may not prove what I set out to prove, but in fact, this is what it does indicate. And I find his work really very, very, very valuable for that reason. And I think that it will continue to be useful to people who do want to take it further and want to explore lines of thought further.
Well, thank you very much.
Really covered the essence of cosmos, chaos, and the world to come. I can't really speak about the other works of Norman Cohn, his last works, other than this one, which I know fairly well. It's a very strange work. I don't mean to disagree too much, but it's a very strange work because you know what I think of Pursuit. I've said that already. This is not classic Norman Cohn, and it isn't. It isn't. I'll tell you how it isn't. At least how I see it. Whereas Pursuit is marked by an attempt to understand the phenomenon from the inside out. Cohn gets at the sources, all the sources, more so than anyone else, really. Perhaps I'm exaggerating, but in that sense, back then, more so than anyone else. And you can see, when you read Pursuit, and when you read it over and over and over again, you can see him wrestling with the sources, and most importantly, understanding what these sources tell him about why people thought the way they thought. So he's actually trying to put himself in the place of the people at the time, and asking, why did they come to these conclusions? What were they thinking? And from there starts making some claims about the social context of apocalypticism and the other things I talked about. The difference, this is the different part. The different part with Cosmos, Chaos, and the World to Come is that this book is much more derivative. I don't get the sense. I really don't. For all his great breadth, he is not an ancient Near Eastern scholar. He doesn't read Akkadian. I don't know. Did he read Persian? Could he read Persian? No, because I didn't get that sense. Even his understanding of the Avesta and the Persian scriptures, I didn't get that sense. So instead of working from the inside out, I think this book works from the outside in. And if you check the footnotes, you'll see it's much more larded with secondary sources than it is primary sources. Not in any great degree, not in any way that's different from modern scholarship, but different from Cohn, and that's the important thing. I really say that. But it's similar. It's similar to his books, at least the books I know, in that it is a work of Norman Cohn, paradoxically, in the sense that it is entirely distinctive and it is magnificent in its scope. Now, the point, I won't repeat the entire content, but let me give the backstory here. The big question is this. Can we posit Zoroastrianism as a logical antecedent, the logical antecedent to Jewish apocalypticism, when the scriptures, the classic Iranian scriptures, were only products of the medieval period? That is to say, can we look at these scriptures? And it's not a question of looking at gospels that may have been written a generation or perhaps two after the events of Jesus. And even that's fraught, as we well know, with problems. Here you're talking a gap of 1,000, 1,500 years. And Cohn says yes. And in this I think he follows the bulk of scholarship. He wrote 20 years ago or something, and this debate is ongoing. But still, the weight of scholarship is on the fact that you can understand, you can examine the Middle Persian scriptures, and in them see the Zoroastrianism, perhaps not maybe of 1000 BCE, but certainly of the Imperial Persian period, which rose in the 6th century with Cyrus the Great and lasted for about 250 years, if I have my sums correct, until Alexander came and just wiped out everything. But this was the period in which in which early Judaism was formed, maybe a little bit before the Babylonian conquest in 587, 588 BCE, with the reign of Josiah in 621. But this was the period in which Judaism was formed. And so I see cosmos, chaos, and the world to come as having essentially two goals. The first is, I think, and this goes back, I wish I could remember, to an earlier point that was made, where Cohn would rewrite his own work in light of new evidence, to his great credit. And I think the first goal of Cosmos is an attempt to correct the most glaring vakat in Pursuit, which is, of course, to provide the top-down, stability-oriented counterpart to the bottom-up radical millenarianism, which is the subject of the earlier book, and which Cohn articulates through this examination of the ancient Near Eastern combat myth. The second goal is really the present purpose of the book, which is the attempt, as Sham says, to locate in the ancient Zoroastrian tradition, and in particular Zurvanism, the sea change that oriented the elements of the combat myth, this ancient combat myth, to an eschatological horizon, with its essential notions of radical dualism and the end of time, and which, in Cohn's view, stands as the principal conceptual antecedent of Jewish apocalypticism, and thus the apocalyptic worldview. Was he successful? I don't think so. I think there's much to be said, and he says it, and others say the same thing. But the evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, to which I've referred to before, and alongside of that, 40 years of intensive work in ancient apocalypticism, has demonstrated without doubt that the first apocalypse, the first Jewish apocalypse, is not, as it was held for many years, decades, centuries, the book of Daniel, which reached its final form around the year 164 BCE, and which is entirely historiologic in nature and set the pattern for the historical type of apocalypses, or more broadly apocalyptic literature, that would see expression in Revelation and Pseudo-Methodius and Joachim of Fiore, and 2011, the recent prediction in America, and 2012, the one to come in December 21st. The recent research, however, has demonstrated that Daniel and the other historical apocalypses of the Maccabean era, the Apocalypse of the Week, the Animal Apocalypse, strange names, but interesting, were not the first apocalypses, but rather the first apocalypses were probably the earliest Enochic literature, which came out of the Babylonian tradition, which preceded the book of Daniel by at least 100 years, and which, instead of focusing on the end of time, even though that came into the literature very quickly, was very much more concerned with the spatial aspect of apocalypticism, vision of the throne, and scientific data, literally, astronomical data. So, to draw the line, and this is where Cohn is a little bit caught out, I think, by relying too much on secondary sources, to draw the line from a historiologically oriented Iranian dualism, which can be located, I think, in the Persian period, maybe a little before, to the first Jewish apocalypses, which he thought were Daniel, and then thereon to the classic the classic apocalypticism of the ancient, late antique, and medieval worlds, can't really be held sound anymore, because there's a missing link, and it's this other dimension of apocalypticism which expresses itself, as my mentor at Yale, John Collins, has described, as otherworldly apocalypses, which clearly precede the historiologic ones. So I think in that way it doesn't really succeed. Does it succeed, however, at providing insight into this other dimension of the social context of apocalypticism? Yes, very much so. And I think provides the necessary counterbalance, and the answer in some ways to his critics, and gives, in the end, a full sense of really his life's work, which is the social contexts of apocalypticism, millenarianism, and all sorts of beliefs that characterize not just the past, but as we live in this age of apocalypse, it seems very much our future. Thank you.
Thank you. Right.
Really interesting to hear both these presentations because I come into it on the other side as the publisher of those two books, and I backtrack a bit that I wasn't involved in his first three books. And then I received a letter from his agent saying, Norman Cohn is preparing a new book, would you be interested? That's the kind of letter that publishers dream of. And I mean, as many people, I had to shake myself because Pursuit was on my brother's bookshelf when I was 13 and I took it from it. And then the prospect of publishing this man whom I had long thought was perhaps not even there, but if so, wasn't writing, seemed extraordinary. And then when I said yes, I was, the invitation to go to Wood End came, and it's a very difficult place to find in a car. But I did, and arriving late and having lunch with Norman and Vera, and it wasn't as if he was auditioning me, but I think he wanted to see if he was comfortable. And I remember on 2 or 3 visits there was always a lovely lunch, and then there was always a walk, but it was always raining. And so there would be a long walk, after which you come back, and me in my publisher's gear, and you have to take your shoes off at the door. And there's, a great vulnerability in being an author's house with no shoes on. But
it's an old interrogation technique.
I've discovered today from Frank that the reason that letter came from the agent was because Frank had recommended Yale, having published it with it, so that was a lucky break. But the serious point about that is that I suppose I was surprised that the process of putting the final text together was so anguished for Norman, because the author of these 3 crucial works, and he wrote all those before he was 60, which is easy to forget, that I thought it would be straightforward. And I was surprised at the extent to which he changed his mind during the course of it. And it's not, Norman very precisely always knew what he wanted, and if you edited a paragraph and said, could we perhaps say this, and he would sort of look, he would say, I think I prefer what I had first. But on this there were many changes and anxieties, and he was reading books that were coming out and wanting to make changes, which of course authors always do. But Cosmos Chaos was in proofs, and the proofs had been read, and the index was being prepared, and the phone goes, and Norman says, Robert, chapter 10, I think it was chapter 10 will have to go. I thought, publication dates established and so on. And something prompted, and I think it was Zoroastrian chapter, he wanted to rewrite the whole thing. And so this tunes in with what you were saying, that he was exploring and doing it with enjoyment, but there was a level of anxiety which was more than just a few things might need changing. There was something fundamental that he was exploring as he was writing this book, I think.
You were right, probably. It's in his age, isn't it? He felt that he was probably there, he was in his 70s.
Yes, but I think it's more what Lorenzo says, that this is a different sort of book for him, really, where he is, and the sources are often, not primary.
His command of language was absolutely astonishing, but this was completely different, and it wasn't Romance; these were Semitic languages.
Yes, and he was very beholden to Mary Boyce
Yes.
for her work, and was going back and forth, consulting with her about his interpretation of what she had written, as you, I'm sure, encountered.
Yes.
No, he's absolutely. That's the consensus that one can say that, as Norman did, that the Persian scriptures may be located, even though they're medieval in nature, they may be located in that time. However, it seems to be there's a point after which the investigation seems to stop, and that's what I was wondering why. And maybe just an unfamiliarity, as I said, with the sources.
Yeah.
Just because I don't know how historians work, but you were talking about Daniel being the first Jewish apocalypse.
For a long time, it was
Yeah.
considered that.
But you see, not being an historian, I wouldn't know that.
Mm.
Whereas what does come across quite strongly in Cosmos Chaos is that he seems to locate that switch in mindset towards the apocalyptic at the second Isaiah. It's second Isaiah where he sort of starts to says that this is where it begins, and then Enoch.
Yes. Now that opens a big can of worms. You're absolutely right. But now we're starting to talk about, and this is I referred to this slightly. I don't want to go on. But I referred to this slightly when I was talking about how Norman got by locating the point of entry into the research at the level of the worldview. He avoided balkanizing the investigation into all little texts or all little movements or whatever you want. But I also said that he also avoided talking about apocalypticism as just one subordinate part of a larger worldview, which includes, in the ancient world, prophecy, divination, so on and so forth. Now, part of that argument may be that there's... where does apocalypticism begin? For those who would consider this large cloud of divinatory and mantic and prophetic traditions, there's really no distinction between prophecy and apocalypticism. Whereas some others, and I fall into this camp, see the worldview as far more defined from prophecy. So whereas you have in Isaiah or Zechariah, or Ezekiel, for instance, some of the later prophets in the biblical tradition, a certain, what it used to be called proto-apocalyptic mindset, which one might say is true also of Zoroastrianism. There were some fundamental changes that looked like they happened by the 2nd century, not the 4th or 5th BC, which causes the worldview to come into sharp and unmistakable focus. And if it did happen before that in the Jewish literature, assuming that what I am and others are saying is correct, there's no evidence of that. You see, I mean, I know what you're getting at, and it could certainly be read that way, and many people do read it that way. But I just don't see it that way because not only in my view, but I think maybe Norman would have agreed too. That would diffuse a notion of the worldview beyond what I consider to be a workable set, as we've all said, a workable set of propositions that are supported by claims and corollaries, which distinguish it from these other traditions. But it could go either way. I don't. And that's how I feel. I feel that way. But I feel that way because I'm looking to. John and I had this discussion. We're looking to understand the worldview as a global and historical phenomenon, and it just can't be done if I have on the one hand the Book of Daniel and on the other Om Shinrikyo, and say that these are separate and not see the fundamental linkage between them. John.
I just wanted to take up Sham's point about whether I'm not capable of engaging in the specificities of change here, but the point you made, which was a nice point about the potential context in which a sort of cultural narrative might have resonance for people, a change of circumstance which renders up things like that. So I just wanted to sort of proffer that to people, but then with two questions. One is, if there's something to that, and in a sense in some ways that has to speak to a lot of the work that Cohn has done in a whole variety of contexts about why these fantastic stories have life to them and are not just immediately dismissed. The two questions are, firstly, is viewing them through a psychoanalytic framework the only possible or indeed the most productive way of doing that? And the second question is, how confident as historians are we that we can, from the sources available to us, actually see the way in which those stories are received as opposed to the ways those stories are reported. To give a modern parallel, if we looked at the Daily Mail, we would encounter a number of narratives, some of which I would claim are slightly fantastical, about non-British others in modern British society. But I would want to have some other sources that would allow me to understand how the readership of the Daily Mail actually interpreted those stories, to properly understand what they then did with those stories. So And as you will appreciate, if you go back to a lot of the periods that Norman Cohn wrote about, you don't have even the breadth of stuff that the Daily Mail offers. You have a chronicle, or you have, a mention here, or you have a problematic trial conducted under torture. So, but I wanted to throw it out, but not dictate. So, is the psychoanalytic the best way of getting at it? And can we, in any case, really get at it as historians when we're dealing with textual traces and not the past?
Well, it may not be the best way of getting at it, but it might be a useful way of getting at it, mightn't it? And there may be also, it may be one contribution to the whole thing. One of the things I was interested in the discussion was how, as a psychologist, how are apocalyptic fantasies generated in the people who generate them. And I'm not sure that I've put this together very well, but one of my associations with this is a very interesting paper by a Jungian analyst called Joe Redfern, who died a few months ago. And Joe Redfern wrote a paper some time ago about dreams of nuclear war, which is rather an apocalyptic scenario. What did he think they were about as an analytical psychologist? He thought they were about people struggling to cope with the bursting into consciousness of desires, thoughts, impulses that had been repressed. And if you apply that to what's been said about apocalyptic fantasies, a key element in them is the element of secrets being revealed. That speaks also of shameful secrets, doesn't it? Something that we don't want to be revealed suddenly coming into consciousness. One of the things that priests tell me, priests I mentioned earlier, this is why I mentioned it, an awful lot of them seem to learn in theological college a very useful insight, which is, they all tell me this, when you preach a sermon, you're preaching to yourself. You're preaching about your own stuff. In other words, you're moralizing, you're using ancient texts to talk about issues that trouble you. Now, it may be that the priests and the leaders of apocalyptic movements were motivated by that sort of thing, but that it resonated, what they were saying resonated in some profound way with the people Norman describes as responding to those sorts of ideas.
Just add a little on the experiential. Before I became chair of religion, I spent 5 years in the Department of Theology. And there's a great reluctance on the part of theologians and scholars alike to understand the phenomenon of apocalypticism from the experiential point of view. That is to say, in plainest forms, that a great number of these people actually had visions. That they, well, I don't know how to, I'm not a psychiatrist, I have no background in that. So I may be using terms that are inappropriate to this discussion. But from my point of view, using the language of theology and religion, they may have had visions. They may have seen what they saw. That's often overlooked.
Could I just answer that, respond to your question about is psychoanalysis the best way of looking at these things? It's certainly not the only way, but I think that what it can contribute, which no other way of looking at things can contribute, is a way of trying to disentangle fantasy from fact. And I think that this is one of the real problems for history, or for an understanding of current affairs even, that what happens, and this is what this is what psychotherapists and analysts try to do with our patients, is try to separate out what is in their internal world from what is out there in the external world. And it's what people, what people's experience might be. For instance, say you have it is part of your life's experience to feel crushed, to feel humiliated, to feel, made small, made, disregarded, that sort of thing. And something happens in external reality that makes you feel that way. Now, both those things are true. There is an external reality in which something is happening to make you feel humiliated, make you feel small, make you feel disregarded. But there is also, it's met by an internal experience, which perhaps might magnify it, or create, turn it into something more than it actually is. And part of what we try to do is disentangle what has actually happened in reality from what has what the internal experience is. And I think that this could be something really quite useful in terms of looking at. But lots of people are wanting to speak.
Well, I was listening to the earlier comments, and I thought perhaps I should mention something that hasn't been put on the table that I think is relevant to the discussion. And that is the whole notion of election and chosenness, which emerges from the whole evolution of the Zoroastrian trope in Norman's work. And most people here know a little bit about, first of all, the redating of when the Zoroastrians existed, which came too late for Gordon Vidal to notice when he wrote his book, but which Norman was well aware of. So it pushed the beginning of Zoroastrianism much farther back than Gordon Vidal recognized. I wonder if there isn't some kind of convergence here between what we talked about in the earlier sessions and the notion that when disaster strikes your people, you are being tested by the monotheistic God, the highest and only one. And then you must prove your mettle if you wish to reap the benefits of the disaster. Now, culturally, this was, let's accept for the sake of discussion, that Zoroaster rallied his people in this way from the brink of extinction, and that they were so demoralized that they were suicidal, and he saved them from that by saying, no, don't grieve anymore. Now there's a new path, and it's a path to an incredible future. It will be a perfect and wonderful future, etc., etc. What impact does that, first of all, different cultures respond to such disasters in different ways, and they borrow from each other. So, what is it? After the Holocaust, there were many different explanations among Jewish theologians, and some I wouldn't even dignify with that name, about why these things happened to the Jewish people. One theory, which the Neurokarta and others advocate as well, is Jews were so evil in the way they behaved prior to the Holocaust that the wrath of God was visited on them, etc., etc. But I don't know anybody, but this may be my ignorance, in the Jewish tradition who went back to Zoroaster's reaction. And I guess one reason would be that Jews already believe they're the chosen people. So it doesn't work. If you're already the chosen people, then a disaster like the Holocaust isn't the first time, nor perhaps the last time you're going to be tested this way. So you just have to, you have the contract with God. But there are the Puritans who are, again, very different. There are the Tutsi of Rwanda, etc. I think this is a very fertile area for analysis and comparison. And I do know that with respect to the Puritans in America, there's really no question, I think, I mean, Perry Miller showed this and others have shown this, that the impact on them of the notion of being chosen in respect to their relations with Native Americans in New England, etc., was absolutely toxic to their neighbors. I mean, they were absolutely impossible to live with because they decided that if they wanted your land, you were the agent of the devil. They decided that if a captain of a ship turned up dead one day on the shore, then your people certainly committed it, the murder, and therefore your land was forfeit. And Roger Williams had great trouble with them with the other Puritans, because he felt they weren't really serious about converting them to the native people to Christianity, whereas he was. And he thought they couldn't be redeemed, the native people could be redeemed. The other Puritans just felt this was not of any interest. And he felt that, I think, they had taken the Chosenness trope so far that they had read themselves into a totally fantastical world and were out of touch with the reality around them.
Yes. Thank you. Well, there are two other speakers, and I can't, I'm afraid, take them because we're now out of time. So I'd like to thank everybody very much. And perhaps hand over to Robert.